Hello, and welcome to the Art of Aging part of our podcast series from the Center for Abundant Aging in United Church Homes. I love having these conversations that are inspiring and uplifting, and what it as we explore many ways about what it means to age in the 21st century. Today, I have the joy of welcoming Eddie Gonzalez. Welcome, Eddie.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Eddie is an impact fellow at CoGenerate and a leader working at the intersection of spiritual care, storytelling, and intergenerational connection. With a background in journalism and creative writing, Eddie became a hospice chaplain in 2009 and has spent over 15 years cultivating meaningful spaces for reflection, listening, and dialogue across healthcare and national nonprofits, including On Being and StoryCorps. Raised in a multi-generational household, his work is deeply rooted in the belief that storytelling can bridge divides and deepen human connection. He is a 2026-2027 Moth Fellow at NYU's More Than Human Life program and serves on the board of the podcast Threshold. So, first of all, Eddie, I knew when we first met online that there was a connection, but I have to say that in your bio, spirituality, storytelling, intergenerational, on being, StoryCorps, and the Moth, you've just named a large part of my own world. So I've been energized every time we've had conversations. So your career spans journalism, chaplaincy, and community storytelling. So how did that journey unfold for you?
Yeah. Well, and I've been energized by our conversations too. So I just want to affirm that and say it's been a joy to meet and glad to be in this conversation with you. And yeah, I think my journey has been very unexpected, and in a lot of ways it has moved from a lot of intuition. I When I first went to college, I was a business major and very quickly noticed that I was just writing poems in my notebook margins and keeping journals. And I had a friend that pointed to my bookshelf at home and said, "You see all these journals, why aren't you in journalism?" And I was like, "That's pretty smart." And I ended up working for the university press there for an editor, and I had elders that were there. I had one of the senior editors come up to me and say, if you want to be a full-time editor, we would love to support you in that. You'll need a master's. Start thinking through what that might be. And another elder that was working on design who said, they have masters for creative writing. And I ended up going into this creative writing sort of realm with an MFA. And while I was there, fell in love with the workshop setting where folks were telling stories and sort of asking one another what stories we're trying to become. And while I was finishing my manuscript, my mom, who's a hospice nurse, introduced me to a chaplain. And that chaplain said, people are telling stories at the end of their life, and they're trying to make sense of those stories. So they oftentimes need to say them multiple times. What would happen if you started visiting people and brought the spirit of the workshop into some visits with people that are on hospice? And I said, yes. And that was like stepping on a rocket ship. My life changed. I was listening to On Being and StoryCorps, coincidentally, while I was doing that work. StoryCorps because I was interested in the possibilities of recording stories, and On Being because it was diving into spiritual questions at a time when I was having to really reckon with my own spiritual life, while also trying to provide support for people's spiritual lives at end of life. And so it's been a beautiful thing. At the end of an On Being episode, there was a StoryCorps clip. I went to the website that night. They were looking for somebody to train healthcare teams. I applied. They invited me to New York. And while I was at StoryCorps, I met the On Being team, joined their team, and was doing a lot of community engagement. So this mix of media and community engagement, it feels like I've just found my way into.
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, I just want to say that for all who are intuitive, artistic, fine arts people, to have a business undergrad is not a bad thing.
Totally.
There are many times when I wish maybe I should have had a little bit more of that myself.
There are times I've wished the same thing.
So, in addition to all that, even before college, you shared that growing up in a multi-generational household helped to shape this path as well. So how
Yeah.
did that experience as a child, how does that continue to influence your work today?
Well, I grew up in a household. I have my parents and my brother and my sister. When I was young, we, sort of began very humbly living in apartments and, renting. And my parents made the sort of wanted to buy a house. We moved in with my grandparents, lived with them while they were saving money. And so there was always there was an in between when I was living with my grandparents while I was a child, and then we moved into our own home. And then when I got older, my grandfather had dementia, and my grandmother needed extra support as that got worse. And my parents ended up moving in with my grandparents to provide them with that support. And my grandma still lives with my parents. My grandfather has passed, but I go home and it's like I'm there now with my grandma and my parents and my sister, her kids, and there's just so many generations that are there. And I think around the dining table, in the household in general, just stories, questions, and wisdom and food, of course, shared. But it was really a place where I found a lot of reverence from my elders in terms of lived experience, but also in terms of their reverence towards God and the spiritual life. A sense of humility in terms of what they felt like they knew, but also what they had to learn from me and from multiple generations, from other people of different backgrounds, also of different beliefs. And in that way, just a very compassionate household where we showed up for one another across age and saw where needs were, showing up at different times in our lives. And so, yeah, I feel like it informed a lot of, yeah, it really is a big part of who I am.
Yeah, we intentionally built a home with my mom and my sister, so an intergenerational home, and we had moved in about 6 months before my mom sold her house and moved in, and she hadn't been there more than a week, and we were around the dinner table, and everybody was talking about their day, and we were laughing, and all of a sudden, mom started crying,
Mm.
and or she had tears, and we just looked at her. We're like, "Mom, are you okay?" And she said, "Yeah." She said, "I you don't laugh like this at the dinner table when you eat by yourself." And so it was as much.
Wow.
We quickly discovered it was as much about the food at the table as it was the laughter and, as you said, the stories that are told. So
100%. That's
yeah,
so beautiful. Thanks for
yeah,
sharing that. Yeah.
yeah. So now you've spent these years gathering oral histories, facilitating conversations, listening to people tell of their own personal experience. What have you learned about how stories connect people?
Well, it's funny. I mean, I was thinking about what you just said, and I'm like, part of the beauty of being at a dinner table and sharing stories with one another is that you hear the news, but in a very personal way.
Mhm.
That there's the news cycle of what we read in the media, but there's also just what's happening in your life, what's happening in our community. Um, and it gives us the possibility for showing up for one another. Um,
Yeah.
so I think in some ways it's a deep form of connection. It's very different than sort of talking from a place of this is what I believe, this is what I think, and just sharing opinions. But it's really a generous place where we can share what's happening in our lives. In some ways, I think it's also this beautiful point where we can connect to something that's much bigger than ourselves in terms of time. Um, I had a mentor who used to say people are living historical documents, or like, and that we carry sort of the legacies and histories that we've lived of our places and of the families that we come from the communities. So, yeah, I feel like it gives us this incredible, I don't know, entryway into life as it's lived beyond just one lifetime. And it's also some really meaningful place where we can form connections not just in spite of our differences, but even in sort of celebration of the differences. Um, yeah, and find ways of I don't know connecting and just yeah just that relational piece based on who we are to love each other for the specifics of who we are.
Yeah. I think that it's a part of being seen, and when you're in conversation, knowing that you're being heard, um,
Absolutely.
and that's a key part of it.
Yeah.
So we're going to dive into your work, even though I'd love, and we'll do this another time, conversations about your other organizations, but specifically with CoGenerate, an
Yeah.
organization that I've been following for many years. And I was really excited when I saw about the research that was being done specifically about intergenerational relationships and faith communities. And you are the person to bring together all of that listening and that research. And it's now called the Honest Conversation Project. Is that correct?
Right. The report that we made based off of all of these interviews that I did with faith leaders was called Honest Conversations. But yeah, I mean, it's exactly what you said. We were interested in co-generation within faith communities.
So I have been saying for a while that intergenerational um, relationships are the superpower of faith communities that we do not claim well. And so part of what was really curious to me and delighted me is that this organization called CoGenerate, who isn't connected and isn't overtly spiritual, what is it that led CoGenerate to step into that research in the first place?
But I think they had a sense that there was something within religious spaces and sort of spiritual communities that was naturally bringing people across generations together, and they were interested in just exploring it more. When I came on board, they had just finished a survey with hundreds and hundreds of people. It was like they were basically asking people inside of faith communities and outside of faith communities what intergenerational relationships and collaboration look like for them. And yeah, we're starting to learn really kind of incredible things about how people in faith communities were already doing more intergenerational connection and collaboration than folks outside of religious communities or spiritual communities. That word religion and spiritual, it gets kind of tricky, so I'll just use them interchangeably here, but I know
Yeah,
that there's also some specifics there.
yeah,
But that they also value it within these spaces, and that they well, I think exactly what you said. I have a friend, Michael Poffenberger, who I interviewed as part of this work, and he said, bringing generations together in faith communities has been a task within the task we didn't realize we were doing.
mm-hmm.
Um, and I think to your point, one of the things that I kept hearing over and over was that people loved that about the experience of being in a community, faith-based community, but they also rarely saw intergenerational work being done intentionally or well. They struggled to imagine what they could do to make it better. Um, and yeah, there was a lot that I learned, but I think one of the big things was that it's just like a superpower, and it's about a culture and an orientation rather than just a program that you create.
Yeah, and faith communities have to be really countercultural, um, because the history of whether you're talking about Christianity or Judaism, we all have adopted in the past century the same age segregated education system, for instance,
Mhm.
as is in the wider culture, and there are reasons for that, and I know having to do with the developmental, um, um, how we develop intellectually and emotionally and all, and some of that is obviously very necessary, but um, as congregations got bigger in the last century, we kind of went, I think, more away from the intergenerational connections. So that's um, why I think this report is so important. So
Yeah.
you distilled that research into some key things. What has stood out most for you?
Maybe one of the things that I'll say stood out for me um, is the ties that can happen in, well, that this is one of the big challenges within religious communities. Longevity oftentimes equals authority in
Mm-hmm.
religious life. And that, the years that you've studied the time that you've volunteered in your community, the money that you've contributed to the church, um, the the spiritual, how long you've been doing spiritual practice in Buddhist communities, for instance, how long you've been meditating. Oftentimes that ends up breaking down along generational lines. And there's a quote by Raymond, who's an advisor to CoGenerate and was a pastor. He said, culture becomes increasingly difficult to shift when you throw people's perception of God into it.
Mm-hmm.
They put their traditions and structures in place and they declare them gods. So for young people to want to change, it's often seen as doing something ungodly. And that tension of how, yeah, age and conflict and power all intersects in the specifics of a religious community felt to me just like, yeah, something that really stood out as distinct and something that was also pointing really directly to some of the more incredible opportunities, actually, of bringing generations together within faith spaces.
Yeah, and I think related to that, my experience serving local churches was that when younger individuals wanted to make some changes, and particularly around the turn of the last century, you could not go to a pastor's conference and not hear workshops about musical style in worship, and
Right.
and and it was hard because as younger individuals said we want some music with some beat, and do we really have to sing these songs that are now five based on melodies that are 500 years old, and by kind of an assumption that by wanting something different that younger generations were completely rejecting those
Mm,
things, those rituals, those parts of the culture that were really important, and particularly with music, we know that it's often observed that the whatever the musical genre was when you were about 13 years old
mhm,
continues to be throughout your lifetime a place where you can go back and sit and feel like you belong. Um, and
totally.
and and so how do you make shifts like that with music and take away what was really important? Um,
You know, you're reminding me of something that I heard from a rabbi, and I'll never forget her this insight. She said that every time you do a ritual, you are also innovating. And the power of recognizing that intersection and its capacity to invite what remains powerful because it connects us to something that's deep and that our generations have done for so long, and it connects us back again to those the time scales and traditions that are much bigger than any individual, but that the innovation piece is also really core because it's what makes it feel like it's alive. It's relating to our lives right here right now, and part of the difficulty and the opportunity is coming together to creatively decide, like, how do we do this in a way that honors our tradition and also speaks to life as it's being lived right now.
yeah, exactly. That's the intersection.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So why do you think that many faith communities are still so age segregated, despite the fact that the research they say they want to be in connection with each other, that they have experienced some of the benefits, and yet communities are still kind of resistant to this?
Yeah. Well, one thing I want to lift up, and it's something, I know I kind of led in with the idea of like the challenge and the opportunity, but I also want to lift up that intergenerational relationships are one of the core reasons that people stay in these communities. And that's one of the things that I learned. And that sometimes it's the absence of those relationships that cause people to leave. Um, One of the amazing things that I heard was that it's like that intergenerational relationship building and also intergenerational collaboration is in its own way a form of spiritual practice. It connects us once again to something that's bigger than us, but then it also invites us to the practices of listening, contribution, showing up for one another. Um, but there was a young person who told me I feel developmentally stunted um, in the ways that my life is not more intergenerational. Something just isn't there. Something's missing. Some part of me is not being nourished. Um, and that there's this, this real question, like, how do we do this well? Because there's such a hunger. Um, so there is age segregation, and also there are many places where it is actually working. And part of the question is how do we find what's working and build off of that. But in terms, back to your question, in terms of why there's age segregation, I mean, I think part of it is just a symptom of what's happening around us in our larger culture, where there is just it's prevalent age segregation, and it's showing up in our faith spaces as well. um, I think some of it is happening because of a really well intentioned, and also something that we shouldn't necessarily lose, which is that people of similar ages benefit from being with one another, in support of one another,
Mhm.
sharing an experience, being in conversation around those shared experiences. That's not to say that's something we should lose. Um, but one of the big insights that I took away from this is that sometimes there's just not a lot of entry points. Back to the idea that people aren't sometimes doing this very intentionally. Um, and so, in that way, some of the structures that have been made within these faith communities are sort of calcified. They've been there for a long time. It's typically people who have been there for a long time who set up the structure. They want younger folks to show up and basically adopt the structure that's already been made. They don't necessarily invite younger folks into the innovating. Once again, like how would you do this? How would we do it together? How would we co-create it? Um, and I think that speaks once again to this idea of conflict. I mean, one of the things that's tough about it is that it's not frictionless. To
Right.
bring people together across age means that there will be inevitable differences, differences of lifestyle, differences of belief, different and approach, and so that's uncomfortable. And I think sometimes the culture, once again, like I can speak from my own experience, like I'm more comfortable in places that don't have a lot of friction. And so being in spaces where that might show up, I can maybe tend to avoid it. Um, and one of the invitations I think we have is to see if there is friction, if there is conflict, how is that a sign of actual, like, something's forming, that's actually a good
Mhm.
thing and a
Yeah.
very natural, sort of a sign of success. It doesn't mean that it's failing. um, and how can we increase our capacity for discomfort in order to get the thing we're actually really hungry for.
I was just sitting here reflecting. I was visiting a church on Sunday, and at the beginning of the service, as the pastor was kind of setting the stage and doing announcements and all that, mentioned that the flowers that were adorning the chancel area were in honor of the 50th wedding anniversary of a couple that was apparently there. And she was looking
Mm.
at them and talking with them. And she said, wow, 50 years. Would you be willing to serve as a mentor to some folks? And I thought, okay, Pastor, you have this idea about some intergenerational relationships. So, how do we follow up on that and not just allow that to be a little, well, that was a cute little thing to say at the beginning of the service? Because,
Yeah,
yeah, where else do we find multiple people who have been married for 50 years or, in second marriages, and the second marriages are 20 and 30 years long. And how do we learn from each other and listen to each other about marriage, about whatever the issue is? But yeah,
totally,
yeah,
totally. And it speaks also to, like, there's wisdom in lived experience.
yeah,
There's wisdom in having lived a long life. There's also wisdom in having lived a younger life and seeing what is happening right now. But then it's also really interesting that a lot of, I mean, spiritual traditions are full with wisdom on how to
yeah,
navigate
yeah,
conflict with care and compassion. And so, yeah, back to the idea of it being
yeah,
yeah, how do we bring more attention to it? Lean in.
yeah. I know that one of the concepts that has been lifted up that helps to promote intergenerational relationships is proximity.
Yeah.
That in order to generate relationship, you need to put yourself close to each other, and that can be online, but that you're seeing each other kind of on a regular basis. But that's not enough. What
Right.
else do we need besides that proximity?
Yeah, you'll hear sometimes in CoGenerate, folks will talk about proximity and purpose. And one way of talking about it is, I spoke with a pastor who talked about a brewery that he goes to with his partner, and he sees a lot of proximity at this brewery. There's retirees, there's kids playing, there's a bridal shower that's happening on the table, but none of them are actually talking to one another.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and then you have also another form of proximity where folks aren't talking to one another, but are talking to one another about things of substance. Um,
Mm-hmm.
there was another minister who talked about the need for repair that is never discussed. That sometimes there will be institutions that have, really aspirational values, but folks come together, they're really kind with one another, and they never talk about maybe something that needs repair, something really difficult, painful that happened in the past. And so folks will sometimes come in and be like, if that's not going to be discussed, or if we're not really going to get into what makes this like truly a community, then I don't know that I want to be part of it. Um, so I guess I'm coming back to, my friend Serena says sometimes maybe it's not about new forms or new programs, but it's just about connecting to new purposes. Um, what are we about? What do we care about? And especially in light of, inevitable conflicts among people, if you don't have a mission or something that you're working towards together, sometimes then the conflict becomes the thing that you're focused on rather than the thing to work through in order to get back to the reason that we're coming together in the first place. So yeah, I think the proximity is important, but you also need enough substance and purpose to hold people well.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot more in the Honest Conversation report, and but I also want to talk about. There's another set of reports that CoGenerate has published in the
Yeah.
past year, and again, these come from listening and am I getting the titles right? What older adults want younger people to know, or
Uh-huh.
older adult leaders. What young leaders want older adults to know, and what teen leaders want older adults to know.
Exactly.
So, what surprised you about what was heard in these conversations, and now is a part of these three reports?
I mean, I think I have to just keep coming back to just the deep hunger for relationship. I mean, it's part of the thing just across the lifespan that we hear. Folks want to be in community with people across age. Um, and they also don't want to be flattened into a caricature of what another generation thinks about another generation. There's there's a sense that both want to learn from one another. They want to be heard. They want to be experienced as people with valuable life experiences, and that quality of mutuality is the thing that they're trying to learn and what they would benefit most from. Um, yeah, I also want to say that the lifestyle mismatches are definitely something that you hear. One, uh, another reverend had said, young people are saying to me, "Oh, the older generation's ghosting me," and the older generations are saying, "Well, I don't text," and so there's this stalemate that's happening. And so, yeah, I guess what surprises me is just the hunger, and then even just the small mismatches that can sometimes get in the way. Um, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. You know, older generations, there were you talked to somebody, you sent mail, uh, you may have shared a telephone with neighbors
Hmm.
from your community to begin with, and eventually you got your own. But the ways we can communicate with each other today are so
Yeah.
vast that yeah, how do we bridge some of the just the mode of communication
Yeah.
gaps?
I also want to say that there's much larger things, right, than just the small things. And it sort of
Yeah.
comes back to the idea of like what's not being discussed, what's not being brought in. There was a rabbi who talked to me about, like, he used to joke that bringing young people is about like adding alcohol sometimes. Like, for 20 somethings, it was like, oh, well, let's just get some beer and they'll be happy. When actually what we're hearing and what I heard a lot was that younger people aren't coming to church just to feel good. They want a strong sense of ritual. They want to be engaging community and spiritual practice with depth. They want to show up to help people that are in need of help. And if it doesn't feel right, and if that substance isn't there, then they leave. And so, like, also the deep desire across ages to have something of real substance.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. There's a little bit of evidence that's showing that younger generations are coming back to and joining faith communities, because they've tried finding those connections. They've tried to find the meaning to life in other places that have been very hollow, and so they're slowly maybe finding their way back into faith communities, recognizing that those faith communities they know are not perfect, and there are some things about the institutions that bother them. But I think this goes back to your comment earlier. So how can we all participate, recognizing that these are human institutions, and how do we repair what what every other generations, all generations are seeing as being the flaws? So yeah,
totally. Where else can I go to have that depth of conversation? Like, what other location not only brings me in contact with people of different generations, but also asks the biggest questions about what it
yeah,
means to be alive? I mean, yeah, yeah, it's incredible.
yeah. So, what happens when people at different life stages engage in the same text, like scripture, from their own perspectives?
Mm. Well, I think once again, it invites storytelling. Um, there's a way that reading a piece of scripture invites you to start to say, like, well, how do I make sense of this based off of what I'm seeing, what I've um, what I've experienced, and that way there's an invitation to sort of speak across differences of experience, and it doesn't mean that you're always going to have the same interpretation. um, I think some really beautiful examples were given as I was hearing people in communities, different rites of passage,
Mm-hmm.
where olders and youngers were being honored, but were being invited to be teachers. I mean, one of the things that I think it's been a mindset shift for me over the past few years has been the idea that just because you're older doesn't make you an elder, and that an elder can be someone really of any age who's lived through something and has wisdom on the other side of it. Um, and so yeah, I'm really, I don't know, inspired by the idea of like the that a text can invite people to be a teacher regardless of age, speaking from their point of view of experience.
Yeah, I think in the Christian faith, um, there's a lot of emphasis and a lot of talk about giving,
Mm,
and there's an assumption then that I have power to be able to give to others, whether that's knowledge or money or whatever. But we're also to receive, and I don't think we spend enough time talking about how do we as faithful people receive um, the stories, the life lessons, the help that we need, and I think that that is one of the keys to aging well, is not just an understanding that I'm an elder and I have something to give, I have wisdom to give, life experience, but I don't know it all, I don't have it all, and so how do I ask for what I need, and how do I receive from people regardless of how much younger they are than I am? Um, I think that's
absolutely.
a potential sermons there. If I say, can I put an S at the end of that? Sermons.
There is a sermon there for sure. And then how many spiritual messages talk about yeah, like a transformation
Yeah.
of an old self
Yeah.
being released because something has broken through and changed us. And I think when we're in authentic relationship with one another, I mean, I know this through being in friendships, through being in marriage. I am not the same person on the other side of these relationships because what I've learned from them, what I've heard from them has changed me. And in that way, like, yeah, comfort's great, but it's it's not where growth usually happens.
Right.
And so
Right.
being on
Right.
the receiving, yeah,
Yeah.
receiving from other people, even if it is uncomfortable, sometimes it's powerful.
Yeah. So, editor,
Mm,
journalist,
mm.
storyteller, chaplain. Apart from what you officially wrote in the reports for CoGenerate, what's one mindset shift that you personally would like listeners to take away about intergenerational relationships?
Oh, I mean, I think the yeah, it has to do with this movement from outreach to co-creation. That's what I would say. Moving from the idea of like, come join us
Mm-hmm.
into something that's more like, how can we join you and how can we create something together? Um, there was a mindset shift in even in some of what I heard with church communities who were asking the question of going be outside of their church walls, outside of their church community, to their neighbors, and instead of saying, "Hey, come to this thing that we're doing," saying, "How can we bring our time, our space, our networks, our resources, and come alongside your efforts?" A very different way of approaching things, but when you translate that also in terms of age, um, my friend Katie says younger generations aren't looking to meet you where you are; they're looking to co-create. It's not about inviting me in; it's about building something together. Um, and I think back to that idea of like the old self and the new self,
Mm-hmm.
uh, how we change. I have another friend, Michael, um, who works for a Catholic organization. He told me the moment you abandon the self survival instinct, you create an energy that people want to be part of. The spaces that feel alive aren't turned inward into preserving themselves. They're out in the community. They're doing creative work. So
Yeah,
I would say that mindset shift is, yeah, that would be the big one for me.
that that's great. We're going to continue to talk. It's not always going to be recorded on podcast,
It sounds
um,
great.
but we do need to bring this to a close. But before we do, I just want to make sure to let people know that we are very excited that you're going to be joining us in October of 2026, October 16th to be exact, at our annual symposium. And because we're looking at engaging generations, connecting lives so all can thrive. And I'm so excited that you're able to come and join us and participate in that day. And for more information, I just direct people to our website, abundantaging.org, as that information about that event is populated on the website, and you can buy your tickets. It's both hybrid, online, and in person.
Yeah,
So,
I'm
but
excited to
before
be
we,
there. Thanks for inviting me, and I hope, yeah, you all listening, wherever you are, I hope
yeah,
to be with you.
but we can't close out a podcast because there are three more questions that we ask of everybody. And are you ready for these three? We always
Okay,
let
let's
folks
hear
know
it.
what they are ahead of time.
Yeah, yeah.
When you think about your own aging, what has changed about you, and what do you like about your older self?
What's changed about me is that I don't try to change myself to fit in as much, but I'm willing to speak from my like authenticity and have experienced enough now people who are will love me in my difference and not just in my capacity to be the same. And that I'm more willing now to reach out, um, for help, for, or even just for company, instead of like isolating or feeling like I have to go out on my own. Again, I think at this time in my life, I feel more connected and loved and resources than ever before, um, because of how I've changed as I've gotten older. So,
That's what you were talking about earlier, the transformation process that we're doing, right?
yeah, yeah.
So, second question, what surprises you about what you're doing at your age right now?
Taking a very big leap into our relationship with the more than human world, or what might be called the natural world, and taking seriously how my connection with the earth has been, yeah, how the earth has been calling me, and I am responding to that call. And yeah, that it's becoming a really big place of my own spiritual life and my own creative inquiry. I don't know where it's headed, but I'm saying yes to it.
Okay, I have a whole lot of questions related to that. I'm very curious.
Yeah.
But we're going to go on to the third question. Is there someone that you've met or someone who set an example that inspires you to age abundantly?
Yes. Um, Actually, the person that introduced us, Beth, my friend Marcy Albaher, who is who's been at CoGenerate for a while now. She has friends of every generation. She is insatiably curious.
Yep.
She is always walking, reading, setting up conversations with people, setting up gatherings, experimenting. Actually, one of the big things that she has always taught me is, what's a small experiment that you can do if you've had an insight that you want to take seriously? And she does, yeah, she does relationships, and she does experimentation, and her work with so much, not just deep care, but humor, and
Yep.
again models that sense of like humility that she's learning along the way. She knows that she'll make mistakes here and there, and she's here for the growth and the working through it.
Yep. And I don't know
Yes.
Marcy well, but I know her, and yeah, I see all of that in her as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Eddie. If anyone wants to be in touch, where can they find you? How can they connect with you besides calling Marcy to say?
Yeah, well, I mean, they can connect with me on LinkedIn,
Okay.
and they can definitely reach out to my email address if they would like. Is it appropriate to say my email address if
It's
folks want to?
completely up to you.
My email address is eddie@gonzalezjr.me, and Gonzalez is spelled GONZALEZJR.me. So yeah, would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for
Okay.
listening, if you've listened all this way.
Yeah, and I invite people to check out the reports that we mentioned that you've been involved with, the Honest Conversations, particularly for faith communities. It's on CoGenerate's website, and then the other three about the different generations. Thank you to our listeners for your time with this episode of The Art of Aging, part of United Church Home's Abundant Aging series. If you would like to participate in conversations around aging abundantly, you can visit us at abundantaging.org. In the meantime, may you look around you and identify a person who's aging ahead of you, who influences your understanding of how you can age abundantly by their aging example. Until next time, blessings.